Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker and a little stranger. A time of curfew bells and guttering candles, of the marshy ground on the wrong side of the river, and the houses the city fathers preferred not to look at too closely. We are going to spend tonight in and around a medieval brothel and find out what that world was really like. And if these slow little journeys through history bring you any comfort, if they soften the edges of the day, you might quietly tap the like button or subscribe so the channel can keep them coming night after night. There is no rush at all. That can wait until morning. So, we are going somewhere you would never, in your waking life, choose to go. We are crossing a river. It is late, and the city behind us has already pulled its shutters and snuffed its candles, because honest folk are abed and the curfew bell rang an hour ago. The bridge under your feet is wood and stone, slick with the day's traffic, and below you the water moves black and patient and entirely indifferent to your survival. On the far bank, the proper city does not extend its hand. That bank belongs to a different sort of district altogether, the kind that grew up in the places the city fathers preferred not to look. The marshy ground, the downwind side, the wrong side of the river. We are going to eschew. Now, that word may conjure something warm and brothy, and once upon a time it did mean a heated bath, a place of steam and tubs, and a sweating attendant with a bucket. But by the age we're visiting, the word had drifted, the way words do, until stew meant a brothel, plain and simple, and the bath was mostly a polite fiction that everyone agreed to keep believing. We are walking toward one of these houses, with its whitewashed front required by law so that no one could pretend they didn't know what it was, and a painted sign, and a doorway spilling a low orange light and a low murmur of voices into the dark lane. And here, my drowsy friend, is the honest truth I promised you, the small confession at the heart of tonight's tale. You would not last a single night here. Not one. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean it as the simple arithmetic of the place. You, with your clean teeth and your understanding of germs, and your quiet expectation that the water will be safe and the bed will be yours alone, and the law will, broadly, be on your side. You would be eaten alive, gently and thoroughly, before the candle guttered. You would not know which coins were clipped and which were good. You would not know that the smiling man by the door is the one who keeps order with his fists, nor that the woman pouring the ale has already taken your measure and found you soft. You would not know the rules, and a place like this runs entirely on rules, unwritten ones, fierce ones, the kind that everyone learns by breaking them once and not enjoying the lesson. You would not survive the fleas, frankly, let alone the company. And that is exactly why we are here. Because behind that whitewashed wall is one of the most astonishingly ordinary worlds in all of medieval history, a world with its own economy and its own laws, its own diseases and its own small kindnesses, its own landlords and tax collectors and bishops who, you may be surprised to learn, were. Not to take part, you understand. We are the quietest of ghosts tonight, drifting through the doorway and up the worn stairs and into the lives of the people who actually lived this, who were born near here and worked here and grew old here, if they were lucky enough to grow old at all. Sometimes the very people collecting the rent, for this was not the shadowy secret you might imagine. In many a medieval town this trade was licensed, regulated, taxed, hemmed about with rules concerning which days it could open, and what the women must wear and how much they might charge, and whether they could be Christian or married or in debt. It was tolerated by men who wrote long, anxious sermons about sin, on the theory that it was a sort of drain, a channel cut to carry off a flood they believed would otherwise burst the banks of decent society. It was a business. People kept accounts. People sued each other over it. and the people who lived inside it were not symbols or warnings or anything so tidy. They were women, mostly, often very young, often poor past your imagining, who got up each morning in a cold room and faced a day's work the way you face yours, with weariness and habit and the occasional unexpected laugh. So over the chapters ahead, while the night does its slow work on your eyelids, we are going to walk through the whole of it together. We'll learn how a house like this came to stand here, and who allowed it, and why. We'll meet the woman who runs it, and learn what she takes from the till. We'll find out what the rooms looked like, and what the beds were stuffed with, and what, dear listener, the beds were also home to, in their many-legged thousands. We'll talk about the money, always the money, the rents and the fines and the clever ways a poor woman might be kept perpetually one coin short of freedom. We'll talk about the law, which had a great deal to say. We'll talk about the church across the river, scowling and profiting in equal measure. And we'll talk, gently and never crudely, about the diseases that stalked these lanes, and the strange medieval remedies that did rather less good than a quiet night's rest. But all of that is for the chapters to come. For now, simply stand here with me a moment longer in the doorway, half in the orange light and half in the dark. Feel the cool river air at your back and the close smoky warmth ahead. Listen to the murmur of a place that has been awake all the hours you have been asleep, and that will keep its strange hours long after you have safely drifted off. You don't have to go in just yet. You don't have to do anything at all. You only have to let your shoulders sink, and your breath slow, and the wrong side of the river grow soft and far away, as we step, together and unhurried, into a night that began some 600 years before you were ever born. The cobblestones, of course, told you nothing. A town in the year of our Lord 1200 and something arranged itself with a quiet, unspoken sense of where things belonged, and the things that polite people preferred not to name had their own places too, tucked just out of sight, where the respectable could pretend not to know they were. That was rather the point of them. There, while knowing perfectly well. And so we come, gently and without hurry, to the institution that the English called the stews. The word is a soft and steamy one, and it began with steam. A stew, in its oldest sense, was simply a hot bath. A heated room where you could lower yourself into warm water and sweat away the grime of a life lived mostly in mud. In a world where a proper bath was a rare and faintly miraculous luxury, the bathhouse was a genuine comfort, and, for a time, an entirely innocent one. You paid your coin, you eased into the water, perhaps you were brought a little wine and a little bread and a little roasted something on a board across the tub, and you soaked. There is nothing in that to keep anyone awake at night, and indeed it sounds like precisely the sort of thing one ought to do more often. But warmth and wine and undress and privacy have a way of drifting together toward other arrangements, and over the years a great many of these bath-houses quietly became something more than bath-houses. The hot rooms acquired beds, the attendants acquired duties not strictly related to scrubbing, and the word stews slid sideways in meaning, the way words do when everyone is being polite, until to speak of the stews was to speak not of bathing at all, but of the brothel, the bawdy house, the place a man went when he had coin and the night was long. The bath became a wink. By the later Middle Ages, a Londoner who mentioned the stews was not, generally speaking, thinking about hygiene. This blurring is worth dwelling on, drowsily, because it tells you something about how the medieval town actually worked. There was no tidy line between the tavern, the inn, the bathhouse, and the brothel. They overlapped. They leaned against one another. They shared customers and walls and reputations. An inn took in travellers and gave them a bed, and what happened in that bed was not always the innkeeper's concern. except when it was his business. A tavern sold ale, and ale loosened purses and resolve alike, and the woman who poured it might also, for the right consideration, be persuaded to other kindnesses. The bath-house sold warmth, and warmth was an excellent excuse. These were not four separate worlds, but one tangled, candle-smoked, slightly damp world of hospitality at the edges of respectability, and a man could pass through all four corners of it in a single evening without ever quite feeling he had changed rooms. Now, where did the town put all this? Because a town did put it somewhere, deliberately, with a kind of grim municipal common sense. You did not, as a rule, find the stews next to the cathedral, or along the street where the wealthy wool merchants kept their fine timbered houses. You found them at the margins. Across the river, very often, so that a man had to cross a bridge to reach them, and cross it again to come home, the water itself acting as a sort of moral threshold he could pretend not to have stepped over. Or outside the walls, beyond the gates that were shut and barred at curfew, in the loose suburban sprawl where the law was thinner and the rents were cheaper, and the night watch did not look too hard. Or in a particular disreputable quarter, a knot of lanes everyone in town could name without being told, where the tanners and the dyers and the other trades that stank already had been pushed, and where one more pungent trade gave little offence. The medieval mind had a curious, almost weary practicality about all this. The Church thundered against the sin naturally, and meant it. But churchmen and town councils alike had also absorbed a deeply pragmatic argument, one they attributed to no less a figure than St. Augustine, which held that prostitution was a kind of necessary sewer. Remove the sewer, the reasoning went, and the filth does not vanish. It backs up into the respectable house. Tolerate it in one contained, watched, taxable corner, and you spare the wives and daughters of honest men from worse. It was not approval. It was containment. The same instinct that put the gallows outside the gate and the lepers in their own quiet hospital down the road. And so the town drew a ring around the thing it disapproved of, licensed it, taxed it, and rolled over to sleep. Which brings us, on a slow and pleasant current, to the south bank of the Thames, to a stretch of riverside called Southwark, just across London Bridge from the proper city. Here the stews were not merely tolerated but positively regulated, set down in actual written ordinances, with rules about what the bath-house keepers might charge and how their women were to be treated, and which holy days demanded that the doors stay shut. And the landlord, who held the ground on which a good number of these houses stood, who drew rent from this most unholy of trades, was, with a delicious medieval irony that ought to bring a small smile to your face as you drift, a bishop. The Bishop of Winchester held the manor of Southwark, the liberty of the clink, and within his liberty the stews paid their dues to his estate. So it was that the women who worked those riverside houses came to be known, fondly and a little mournfully, as the Winchester geese. To be bitten by a Winchester goose was to catch the diseases that followed the trade. To have goosebumps, some say, though the etymologists will argue, carried a whiff of the same idea. The bishop took his rents from the geese took their living from the river-crossing trade, and the whole arrangement creaked along under the gaze of a church that condemned it on Sunday and banked it on Monday. A woman known to have lived by the stews could be refused burial in consecrated ground, and so on the edge of Southwark there lay an unhallowed plot, a single-acre patch of unmarked earth, where the Winchester geese were laid without right or stone, just outside the holy ground their rents had. And there is one last quiet thing about the geese, the kind of thing that settles over a story like a blanket as the fire dies down. For all that the bishop profited from them in life, in death the church would not have them. Helped to keep up. They paid the bishop their whole lives, and were turned away from his gate at the end of them, to sleep in the soft dark of an unconsecrated field by the river, nameless and unbothered at last. Medieval doors were low, heavy, and meanly hung, built less to welcome you than to keep the weather and the wind out, and so you stoop a little as you cross the threshold, ducking your head the way everyone ducked their head, the way the lintel has rubbed shiny, the hair of 100 years of. And on that gentle, slightly rueful note, with the Thames sliding by in the dark and the bath steam long gone cold, we will let the candle gutter and let you drift and pick up the thread another night. You step in out of the dark, and the first thing the door does is fight you. Customers. The step down is uneven. Your eyes have not adjusted yet. For a moment you stand half blind in a brown gloom that smells of a great many things at once, and your body, sensibly, hesitates before the rest of you decides to follow. The building itself is a modest, leaning thing, timber-framed, its skeleton of oak beams filled in between with wattle and daub, which is to say, woven sticks plastered over with a mixture of clay, straw, and, let us be honest about it, dung, all of it dried hard and lime-washed to a tired off-white. The frame has shifted over the decades the way old timber does, settling into the soft ground, so that no wall stands quite true and no floor lies quite flat, and a dropped coin will roll away into a corner with a purposefulness that suggests the whole house leans gently toward the river. Upstairs, if there is an upstairs, the floor is the ceiling, and you can hear the people up there as if they were standing on your skull. Everything is close. Everything presses in. The rooms are small because small rooms are warmer and cheaper to build, and the warmth, such as it is, matters more than the elbow room. The light is the next thing you notice, or rather the lack of it. There is no clean white glow anywhere in this world after sundown. What you have instead is fire and tallow. Tallow is rendered animal fat, mutton or beef suet boiled down, and a tallow candle or a little dish lamp with a floating wick gives a small, anxious, orange flame that gutters at every draught and throws more shadow than light. Beeswax candles burn cleaner and brighter and smell of honey, but beeswax is dear, the sort of thing kept for churches and for the houses of people who do not need to count their pennies, and so here you make do with tallow, or with rushlights, which are simply dried rushes dipped in fat, and it also smells, faintly and constantly, of the kitchen and the slaughterhouse, a greasy, meaty odour that hangs in the smoke. Clipped at an angle into a metal holder, burning down in a few patient minutes like the world's least urgent firework. The effect of all this is that you live, after dark, in a sphere of dim amber, perhaps an arm's length wide, beyond which the room dissolves into guesswork. Faces loom and retreat. The far corners keep their secrets. The fire is the true heart of the place, and on a winter night you will gravitate toward it without deciding to, the way iron filings find a magnet. It sits in a central hearth or against a wall, and it does the work of heating, lighting, cooking, and drying all at once, which means it also fills the room with wood smoke, because the chimney, if there is one at all, is a recent and imperfect invention. Often there is just a hole in the roof and a vague hope that the smoke will find it. Mostly the smoke does not find it. It pools up under the rafters in a slow blue layer, and it stings your eyes a little, and it works itself into the thatch and the beams and the wool of your clothes, so that you will carry the smell of this evening home with you and into your bed, and it will still be there in the morning. People did not find this remarkable. The whole of life smelled of smoke. A room without it would have felt cold and somehow unfinished. Underfoot is the floor, which is earth, beaten hard and packed flat by generations of feet, and strewn over with rushes or straw or whatever sweet-smelling stuff the household could lay hands on. In a careless house they are not changed nearly often enough, and the bottom layer becomes a slowly composting archive of spilled ale, dropped bones, grease, the leavings of dogs, and small unidentifiable tragedies, all of it trodden down into a faintly sour mat that you would really rather not. In a careful house the rushes are changed and fresh herbs are scattered through them, meadowsweet and tansy and bitter wormwood, so that crushing them releases a green, clean scent meant to mask everything underneath. Examine closely. The straw catches in the gloom and crackles when you shift your feet. It is warmer than bare ground. It is not, by any standard you would recognize, clean. And then there is the damp, which is its own presence in a riverside building, a cold that does not come from the air so much as rise up out of the ground and seep in through the daub. The river is close. You can hear it if the room quiets, a low continuous slip and gurgle, and on still nights its breath comes in under the door as a chill that settles on the back of your neck and into the stones and never quite lifts. The walls sweat. In summer the damp brings mosquitoes off the water and a thick green smell of mud and weed. In winter it turns the threshold to a skating rink of frozen muck, and the cold and the wet between them get into your joints and stay there, which is one of several reasons the people around you ache there. Through the thin wall, or simply from the benches a few feet off, comes the steady human racket of drinkers next door. A low tide of talk that rises now and then into a bark of laughter, an argument about a debt, a snatch of a song that everyone knows and nobody can quite finish, the thud of a... The lower timbers stay dark with moisture and grow here and there a soft bloom of something. Things rot from the bottom up, way they do, and look older than their years. Settle, though, into the noise, because the noise is the warmest thing in the room. Tankards set down too hard, a dog put out from underfoot. The fire ticks and settles. Somewhere a baby grumbles and is hushed. The whole sound is soft-edged and continuous, like rain on thatch, and it asks nothing of you. So this is the inside of it, the whole small world you have stepped into. The leaning timber, the gloom held back by a thumb's width of trembling tallow flame, the smoke laid blue beneath the rafters, the herbs, and the not quite clean straw, the river's cold patient breath at the door, and over all. After the cold and the dark of the street, this wall of close warm human murmur is the real welcome, more than the door ever was, and you feel your shoulders come down from around your ears. Of it, the low gold murmur of people who are warm and a little drunk and in no hurry to go anywhere. It is dim, and it is close, and it is, by the measure of any modern night, faintly squalid. But it is also out of the wind, and it is full of firelight and voices, and on a cold night, 800 years ago, that was very nearly the definition of comfort. The talk goes on, quieter now. The warmth wraps around you, and your eyes, at last, begin to close. You drift now toward the women themselves, and the first thing to set down gently, before sleep takes you, is that almost none of them chose this, the way you choose a trade. Nobody, as a small girl in a medieval village, sat dreaming of such an ending. They were spinners and dairymaids, fishwives and seamstresses, soldiers' companions and innkeepers' daughters, and somewhere along the quiet line of an ordinary life a thread snapped, and there was no one to mend it. That is the truth that hums beneath all the rest, and it is a sadder, softer truth than the loud moralists of the age ever admitted. These were, for the most part, simply poor women in a world that had arranged itself with remarkable thoroughness to give a poor woman almost nothing to fall back on. Consider how a life arrived at that door. A husband died, as husbands did, of fever or accident or the slow grinding of work, and a widow with no land and no grown sons found the rent still due and the bread still wanted and the parish in no hurry to feed her. A father died, and the dowry that would have bought a marriage died with him, and a daughter of 15 or 16 stood in a market town with a bundle and no name that anyone owed anything to. A man promised marriage and then thought better of it, and walked to the next county, leaving behind a girl whose reputation, in the cruel arithmetic of the time, was now worth less than a cracked pot. There were servant girls dismissed without a character, which meant dismissed without the letter that let them be hired again. There were women fleeing a beating, women whose families had simply turned them into the road because there was one mouth too many at a thin table. Debt did its share of the work too, the small relentless debts of the poor, a few pennies to a brewer or a chandler that swelled into something that could not be paid, and the only thing left to sell when everything else is gone is the last thing anyone will buy. So picture them not as a type, but as a row of faces. And notice how young so many of them were. The records that survive, the court rolls and the city ordinances and the disapproving notes of officials, suggest a great many were in their teens and 20s, girls really, with the round unfinished look of people who have not yet had time to become anything. There were older women among them, certainly, women worn to leather who kept the houses, or watched the doors, or could no longer compete, and lived on the margins of the margin. But the heart of it was the young and the unlucky. Country girls who had come to the town because the town was where the coin was, and had found the town perfectly willing to take everything they had and give back as little as it could manage. Their days, you may be surprised to learn, were mostly dull, and there is a strange comfort in that dullness as you settle deeper into your pillow. The hours were filled with the same small chores that filled everyone's hours. There was water to fetch, and a fire to keep and clothes to wash, for a clean appearance was a working necessity, and the laundry never ended. There was mending, and there was waiting, long stretches of plain waiting, the way most of medieval life was waiting, broken by the church bells that cut the day into its slow pieces. Many of them spun thread or took in sewing on the side, because the trade alone rarely paid enough, and a woman of that age and station could always find more work that paid even worse. They ate the food of the poor, the grey bread and the thin pottage and the cheap ale that was safer than the water, and they were cold in winter as everyone was cold, and they had the lice and the aches and the bad teeth of their neighbours. The terror that hung over them was the same terror that hung over every poor body of the age, the fear of falling ill with no one to nurse you, the diseases that spread quietly through close quarters and were not understood and could not be cured, only endured or died of. A woman in this life grew old very fast, if she grew old at all, and many did not. And the choice, the thing we like to imagine a person always has, was mostly a fiction. Yes, in the strict letter of it, a woman might have starved instead, or begged, or thrown herself on a charity that was stretched thin and quick to judge. But a choice between hunger and dishonour is not the kind of choice a comfortable person means when they use the word. The deeper trap was that the work, once entered, was almost impossible to leave. It marked you. The mark followed you into every honest situation you might have hoped for afterward, so that the very thing poverty had pushed you toward then locked the door behind you. Some did escape, it must be said, for the sake of a kinder thought before sleep, into marriage, or into running a small establishment, or simply into the anonymity of moving somewhere no one knew the old story. But the road out was narrow and steep, and most of the traffic went only the one way. Yet the same church and the same town, fathers also, with a sigh of worldly resignation, treated these women as a fixture of city life, something to be managed rather than abolished, fenced into certain streets and certain hours, taxed in effect, regulated, written into the ordinances beside the. Now, how their neighbours treated them is its own curious tangle, and the tangle is more human than you might expect. The official world spoke with two voices at once. The preachers thundered, naturally, and the church named the sin plainly and at length and never tired of naming it. A medieval town could shame a woman in the morning and license her in the afternoon, and see no great contradiction in it, for the men of the age believed, with a logic they found unanswerable, that this trade was a kind of drain that kept worse floods from rising elsewhere, and so they tolerated. Rules for butchers and tanners. The drain while despising the water in it. And the ordinary neighbours, the women at the well and the men at the alehouse, held the whole muddled human range of attitudes that ordinary neighbours always hold. There was contempt, of course, and cruelty, and the casual nastiness of people glad to have someone beneath them. These women were often made to wear a mark, a striped hood, or a particular hem or a coloured cord, so that the eye could sort them at a glance, and the respectable could arrange their faces accordingly. But there was also, threaded quietly through the records, a great deal of plain familiarity, neighbours who knew them by name, landladies who let the room, the woman next door who minded a child or shared a loaf, the small ordinary mercies that poor people have always shown one another in the gaps. They were barred from honest guilds and good marriages and decent burials, and an insult of this kind was the sharpest insult one woman could throw at another, precisely because everyone understood how thin the line was, how a run of bad luck might carry any of them across it. So as you let the day go, hold them gently in mind, this long row of mostly young, mostly unlucky women, fetching their water and keeping their fires and waiting out the bells, more sinned against by circumstance than sinning, neither the monsters the pulpit made of them, nor the merry creatures of. Between the official cruelties, because when you live close to the bone yourself you are slower to believe that misfortune is a verdict. Later legend, but people, simply people, who took the only road the world left open and walked it as best they could. Tomorrow we will follow them indoors, into the houses themselves and the strange small economy that ran them. For now let the bells fade and the faces soften into the dark and sleep. You drift now to the front of the house where the money lives. Every stew, every bath-house, every quiet establishment behind a respectable-looking door had at its centre a person who kept the accounts, and more often than you might expect that person was a woman. The stadtholder, the board, the keeper of the house, the madam in her later name. She was the one who held the lease, paid the rent to the landlord above her, and decided who slept under her roof and on what terms. In a world that gave women so few legal handholds, this was one of the strange back doors to authority. A woman who had perhaps once stood where her tenants now stood, who had grown too old or too shrewd for the trade itself, could end her days as a businesswoman of sorts, sharp with a tally-stick, feared a little, and answerable, in theory, to the law she so reliably bent. She knew the constables by name. She knew which of them could be paid to look the other way, and what the going rate for looking away happened to be that season. The house had rules, and the rules were written for the benefit of the house. A famous set of ordinances from the Southwark Bank, across the river from medieval London, laid out a whole code. A woman could not be kept against her will. A woman could not be held, merely because she owed the keeper money. The doors were to be shut on holy days, and no man was to be dragged. In some well-governed districts the rules were even posted by the authorities, who preferred a regulated sin they could tax to a wild one they could not. Inside against his wishes or drawn in by the sleeve. It all reads very tidily. You may safely assume that the tidiness of a written rule and the tidiness of the actual house were two quite different things, separated by a comfortable distance and a great deal of pretending. Consider the money itself, because the money is the whole quiet engine of the place. A man paid his fee at the door or in the room, and that fee did not belong to the woman. It belonged first to the house. The keeper took her cut, and her cut was generous, the way a landlord's cut is always generous, because she held the roof and the bed and the candle and the small beer, and each of these she rented back to the women at prices she alone set. There was the bed, which was not yours though you worked in it. There was the food, charged by the meal. There was the gown, the good gown that made you presentable, advanced to you on credit and never quite paid off. There was the fee to the house simply for the privilege of being one of its women. By the time the coins were counted and the deductions made, the woman who had earned the night's takings might hold in her own hand a thin remainder, or nothing, or less than nothing. That phrase, less than nothing, is where the cruelty of the arrangement sleeps. The likeliest condition of a woman in such a house was not wage, but debt. She arrived owing, very often, owing for the journey that brought her to the city, owing for the clothes on her back, owing for the first week's lodging before she had earned a penny. And the debt did not shrink as she worked, it was tended, like a garden, so that it grew. A new gown when the old one frayed, a fever, and the broth and the wise woman's powders charged against her name, a slow week when the rent still came due, though the custom did not. Each entry went on to the keeper's tally, in figures the woman herself frequently could not read, and the sum at the bottom was always, somehow, just out of reach. This was the old trick of the company shop dressed in older clothes. You may leave whenever you like, the keeper says sweetly, the moment you have settled what you owe. Knowing, as you both know, that the settling day has been arranged never to arrive. The better authorities saw this and tried, in their fussy way, to forbid it. That very rule from the Southwark Bank, that no woman might be detained for debt, exists precisely because the practice was so common that it needed naming and banning, and a thing only gets banned when it is everywhere. But a rule against debt bondage is a feeble shield when you cannot read the ledger, when the keeper has the constable's ear and you have no one's, and when the alternative to staying is the open road with empty hands and a name already spoiled. So the women mostly stayed, and the debt mostly grew, and the law mostly looked at its own fine ordinance and felt that it had done its part. The economics of it, when you lay the whole thing flat on the table, were beautifully arranged for everyone except the person doing the actual work. At the very top sat the landowner, who might be a bishop, an abbey, a great lord, a respectable city guild. An institution that would never dream of dirtying its hands, but was very content to bank the rent from the property where such things happened. Beneath the landlord, the keeper, taking her cut and her rents and her credit interest. And beneath the keeper, holding up the whole inverted weight of it, the woman, whose body produced the entire income, and whose share of it was the smallest, the least secure, and the first to vanish whenever a deduction needed making. It is a shape you will recognize from a great many trades that called themselves more honest. The pyramid is old, and it is patient, and it does not much care what is sold at its base so long as something is. And it was precarious. That is the word, to carry with you into sleep. Precarious in every direction at once. Her earnings could collapse with the seasons, with a war that emptied the town, with a plague that shut the doors entirely and left the rent still owing on a house with no custom. Her looks were her capital, and her looks were a wasting asset that the keeper had already begun discounting. Illness could end her trade in a week and leave her in debt for the cure. The very luckiest, a small handful, climbed the one rung available and became keepers themselves, holding the tally stick over the next girl through the door, which tells you something a little melancholy about the only ladder the system offered, that to escape being squeezed you generally had to. Age came for her as it comes for everyone, only faster in that life, and a woman past her earning was a woman the house had no further use for, turned out, if she was unlucky, into the same street that had swallowed so many before her, or kept on as a drudge, scrubbing and mending for her bread. Start doing the squeezing. Picture the keeper, then, at the close of a long evening, sitting by a single candle with her notched stick or her greasy ledger, counting. The house is quiet. The men have gone home to wherever men go home to. She tallies what came in, subtracts the rent she owes upward, and adds the rents owed to her from below, and the small column of her own profit sits there in the gloom, real and modest and hard won. She is not, in her own telling, a wicked woman. She is a businesswoman in a trade the world pretends not to see, paying her dues to a bishop's rent collector and her bribes to a constable, and keeping a roof over a handful of women who would otherwise, she will tell you, have nowhere at all to go. And somewhere above her in the same dark house, a woman who earned every coin of that night's takings lies awake, doing her own arithmetic, the kind that never comes out even, the kind that adds up only to the morning. And finding no answer in it, lets the numbers blur and the candle gutter, and there is even a sliver of truth in it, which is what makes it sit so uneasily. At last, like you now, gives up the sum and sleeps. The night has thinned to that quiet hour, when even the most diligent town clerk has set down his quill, and you find yourself wandering, in the gentle way of half-sleep, through the records of a medieval town, and the curious tangle of laws it kept. For here is a thing worth knowing as your eyes grow heavy. The medieval town did not, on the whole, pretend that its quieter trades did not exist. It was far too practical for that. It simply tried to put them somewhere, fence them about with rules, and then look the other way with the studied calm of a churchwarden who has noticed something but would rather not. So the town fathers reached for the great medieval instrument of order, which was not the sword, but the ordinance, written out in a careful clerk's hand and read aloud at the market cross, so that no one might plead ignorance. And the first thing the ordinance concerned itself with was geography, which is a soothing word to drift upon. There was a proper place for everything, and the proper place for certain houses was at the edges. You will find them, again and again, pushed out toward the river, beyond the bridge, hard against the town wall, down some lane whose very name announced its business, with a frankness that would make a modern estate agent reach for the smelling salts. The respectable parishes lay in the middle, clustered close about the church like children round a fire, and the trade the council wished to confine was nudged out to the margins, where the smell of the tanneries and the slaughter yards already kept polite folk away. And once it had fixed where, the law turned with great seriousness to when, for the medieval calendar was a dense and crowded thing, stitched through with feast days and fasting days, and the long sober stretches of Lent and Advent, when the whole town was meant to turn its mind toward heaven, and, out by the water, the law could keep an eye on you while pretending it could not see you at all, away from the flesh. On these days the houses by the wall were to shut their doors and hang up no lamp. No business on a Sunday, none on the great feasts of the Virgin, none through the 40 grey days of Lent, none. on Good Friday. Above all, when the bells themselves fell silent, and the very stones seemed to hold their breath. The logic was tidy and rather touching in its hopefulness. A town might tolerate sin on a Tuesday in October, but it could not be seen to permit it while the priest was lifting the host. You may picture, if it helps you settle, a man with a heavy ring of keys going down the lane at dusk on the eve of a holy day, checking that the shutters were fastened, the way a publican today rings the bell for last orders, weary and unbothered and only doing his job. Now lay your head back and let the curfew fall over the town like a blanket, because the curfew is the gentlest law there is. The word itself comes from the old command to cover the fire, couvre-feu, a sensible rule in a city of timber and thatch where a single stray ember could turn 100 homes to ash by morning. When the curfew bell rang from the church tower, you banked your hearth, you barred your door, and you took yourself off the streets. After that bell, the town belonged to the night and to the watch. To be abroad in the dark without a lantern and an honest reason was itself a small crime, and the women of the lane by the wall were precisely the sort the watch was told to send home. The streets at night were no place for them under the ordinance. Their hours were the curfew's enemy, and so they were swept indoors with the rest of the loose ends. A town tidies away before bed. They were not soldiers, and rarely heroes. They were ordinary householders, taking their turn, bakers and coopers and joiners pressed into the night's service by rota, grumbling softly, calling the hour, rattling the doors of shops to be sure they were locked, and moving along anyone who had no. And who did the sweeping but the watch, those good and yawning men who patrolled the dark with a staff, a horn, and a lantern swinging at the end of an arm? Business under the stars. They challenged the stranger, they doused the unattended flame, they hauled the brawler and the staggering drunk off to spend the rest of the night cooling in the lock-up. Picture them passing beneath your window, the slow scrape of boots, the small bobbing light, a low voice telling the town that it was 11 of the clock. And all, more or less, was well. It is one of the oldest lullabies there is, that voice in the dark saying, "Rest now, someone is awake so that you need not be." But of all the law's many fingers, the one that pressed most plainly upon these women was the law of clothing. For the medieval mind loved nothing so much as a world where you could read a person's whole station at a glance. Your dress told the street what you were. A knight, a friar, a guildmaster, a widow, a Jew, a leper, a servant, a great lady. All were meant to be legible from across the square by the cut and colour of what they wore, and the women of the lane were to be legible too. So the ordinances reached into their wardrobes. In one town they were forbidden, the veil that honest wives wore, that soft modest covering being judged too good for them, so that a bare or wrongly covered head became a kind of badge. In another they were commanded to wear a hood or a cloak, or a knot of cloth in some loud and particular colour, a stripe, a flash of yellow, a band that no respectable woman would be caught dead in. They were barred the fur trim and the silver girdle and the fine veil and the trailing sleeves that the law reserved for their betters, lest they dress above the place the town had assigned them. There is, if you let yourself feel it on the soft edge of sleep, something both cruel and oddly absurd in the whole arrangement. This town that needed the trade badly enough to license it, taxed it, housed it down by the river, and then dressed its women in stripes so as never to have to admit in. The point of it all was to mark them out, to make sure that the eye of any passing wife or watchman or worried mother could find them in a crowd and steer wide, a walking warning stitched in cloth, daylight, what it permitted by night. It is the hypocrisy of every age, only wearing a hood. The same council that drew the rules would, on the morning after a feast, collect its rents and fees from those very houses, and put the coin toward mending the bridge or the wall, and think no more about it. And so the ordinance is read, the shutters are fastened, the curfew has rung, the fire is banked low and glowing, and the watch is making its slow rounds beneath the stars, calling the hour into the dark, so that the whole crowded, rule-bound, contradictory little town may at last lie down and close. The law was less a wall against sin than a kind of plumbing, a system of pipes and valves meant to keep the messier flows of human appetite running quietly out of sight, out beyond the bridge, behind the shuttered window, under the striped hood, away from the part of the town that wished to sleep. Its eyes. There is nothing left for you to do but the same. The laws will still be there in the morning, written in their careful hand, waiting for a clerk to enforce them. But the night, for now, asks nothing of you at all. Let it cover your fire too. Rest now. All, more or less, is well. You wake, more often than not, to the sound of a bell. In the medieval town the bell is the clock, the alarm, the conscience, and the curfew all at once, and the body that rings it is the church, which has an opinion about nearly everything you do between cradle and grave, including the things you would rather it kept quiet about. And here we arrive, at one of the great tender bruises of the medieval mind, the place where holy men in their robes had to look directly at the oldest trade in the town and decide what on earth to do about it. The answer they arrived at, after a great deal of throat-clearing and Latin, was a shrug dressed up as theology. The brothel, they decided, was a necessary evil, not a good thing, never a good thing, but a thing the world was apparently too weak to do without, like a drain you would rather not think about, but cannot quite fill in. The reasoning, if you lie still and let it wash over you, runs something like this. Men, the learned doctors of the church believed, were creatures of overwhelming and slightly alarming appetite, and that appetite, if it found no licensed outlet, would burst its banks and flood into far worse mischief. It would seduce the virgin daughters of honest households. It would tempt the faithful wives of neighbours. It might even, the theologians murmured with a shudder, turn towards sins they could not bring themselves to name above a whisper. Against all of that, the brothel began to look almost like a sea-wall. The great Augustine of Hippo had said it centuries before, in a line that medieval thinkers loved to quote because it let them off the hook so gracefully. Remove the harlots from society, he wrote, and you will fill it with sodomy and chaos. The mighty Thomas Aquinas, sober and systematic, tidied the idea into a metaphor of plumbing. The brothel, he suggested, was like the sewer of a palace. Take away the sewer, and the whole palace fills with filth. Keep it, and the palace stays sweet. It was not a compliment to the women in question, being compared to drains, but it did, for a few 100 years, keep the lamp burning over their doors. So you have the strange spectacle of a society that condemned the act on Sunday and zoned for it on Monday. The same town council that fined a baker for short loaves would license a house of women and take its cut, and the same church that thundered against lust from the pulpit would, with a straight face, accept rents from buildings it knew perfectly well were not being used as bakeries. There is a particular flavour of medieval hypocrisy here that is almost cosy in its honesty, because nobody really pretended otherwise. Everyone knew. The bishop knew. The friar knew. The woman knew best of all. Yet you must not imagine the church was merely a cynical landlord rubbing its hands. The shame was real, and it was poured out from the pulpit in great hot waves. The travelling friars, the Dominicans and Franciscans with their patched robes and their thrilling, terrifying gift for the spoken word, made the fallen woman a favourite subject, partly because she frightened the congregation so wonderfully. You would sit in the cold nave, your breath fogging, and listened to a preacher describe the painted face of vice, the road that led down and down, the worm that dieth not. It was theatre, and it was meant to be. The woman in the sermon was rarely a person. She was a warning, a costume, a smell of brimstone conjured to make the goodwives clutch their children and the young men feel, for an hour at least, the chill of the pit. But sermons were the storm, and the church kept a quieter weather for the soul as well, which was confession. Here is where the medieval system shows its odd, weary kindness. Once a year, at the very least, you knelt in the dim church and told your sins into the ear of the priest, and the trade was no exception. The priest had his manuals, his little handbooks of questions and remedies, and these took a remarkably practical view. A penance was assigned, a course of prayers, fasts, perhaps a pilgrimage, and then, crucially, the slate was wiped. The point was never to crush you flat. The point was to bring you back. A woman of the trade who confessed and resolved to mend her ways was not lost. She was a sheep to be carried home, and the carrying home was, in theory, the whole business of the church. There was even a tender old argument, debated quite seriously, about whether money earned from the trade could be given as alms, or kept by the woman herself, and the cautious conclusion was that she might keep it, since the sin was in the deed and not in the coin. It is the sort of careful, hair-splitting mercy that could only have been argued by men in cold rooms who genuinely lay awake worrying about it. And out of that worry grew the houses, the redemption homes that took their name from Mary Magdalene, the woman in the Gospels whom medieval people had decided, rather unfairly to the text, was a reformed harlot herself. Across Europe these Magdalene houses rose, half convent and half refuge, where a woman could leave the trade and live behind walls in prayer and plain work, washing and spinning and singing the hours. Some women came gladly, weary to the bone of the life, and grateful for a clean bed and a bowl of pottage that asked nothing in return. Others were swept in by enthusiasm and pressure, and a town that wanted its streets tidied. The life inside was strict and grey and safe, which to a tired soul on a winter night may have been the most beautiful thing in the world. Whether it truly redeemed or merely rehoused is a question the records cannot quite answer, and you need not answer it now either. Let it rest. What you cannot let rest entirely because it is too deliciously human is the matter of the clergy themselves, for the men who preached against the trade were not always strangers to it. There were monasteries that owned the very lanes where the houses stood and drew rent from them as placidly as from a mill. There were bishops in southern France and northern Italy whose accounts, examined by later and more embarrassed eyes, show income that did not come from candles. And there were individual churchmen, sworn to chastity, who were known to slip through those low doors after dark like any sailor or apprentice, then rise the next morning to lecture the parish on purity. The medieval mind, which was far less naive than we sometimes flatter ourselves to think, noticed all of this and laughed about it in taverns and in bawdy little verses, in which the fat lecherous friar became a stock figure as familiar as the miser or the fool. It rings for prayer, and it rings for curfew, and somewhere beneath its long bronze voice the town settles into its sins and its absolutions, its rents and its repentances, the holy and the unholy sharing the same narrow streets and the same damp walls, all of them waiting, as you are now, for the church was the conscience of the age, and also, on occasion, the age's most enthusiastic backslider, and it carried both truths at once without ever quite resolving them, because no one ever does. So the bell rings on. Dark to come down. Soft and forgiving over the whole tangled, tired, very human muddle of it. Let your eyes close. The bell will keep watch. It always has. You wake, though waking is too strong a word, to the small, particular itch that meant a flea had found you in the night, and you scratch it the way everyone scratched it, half asleep, without surprise, because the flea was as much a part of the bed as the straw and the dark. Let us talk, slowly and without alarm, about the medieval body and the keeping of it, which is to say, the not quite keeping of it. You may have been told that medieval people never washed and lived in a fog of their own making, and that is not quite fair to them, and not quite a lie either. The truth is gentler and stranger. People did wash, after a fashion. A basin of water by the door, a linen cloth, a scrub of the face and hands and neck before a meal. This was ordinary good manners, and a careful household kept a ewer and a bowl for exactly that. The hands especially, since you ate with them from a shared dish, and nobody, peasant or prince, wanted a neighbour reaching into the pot with fingers fresh from the day's labours. So the visible parts were tended. It was the rest of you, the parts under the wool, that went quietly unattended for long stretches, and grew accustomed to it, and so did your nose, and so did everyone's. For the deeper cleaning there was the bath-house, and here the Middle Ages will surprise you, because the early medieval town was fonder of a hot bath than you might think. The bath-house, the stew, from a word for a heated, steaming room, was a real and respectable institution in many towns for a good long while. You paid your coin, you sat in a great wooden tub lined with cloth so the staves did not pinch, often with a little board across it to hold your bread and ale, because a bath was a social thing, an afternoon's pleasure, and you might share the water and the gossip with friends. The water was heated over a fire and carried in by the bucket, which was labour, which is why it cost money, which is why for most people a true hot soak was an occasional treat rather than a weekly rite. A warm room, shared water, food and drink, a relaxed afternoon, private corners. The bath-house drifted, in town after town, from a place of washing toward a place of other arrangements, until the stews came to mean the bawdy quarter outright, the cluster of houses where you went for company. Men and women sometimes bathed together, sometimes separately by the rules of the house, and the whole business was, for a few good centuries, perfectly ordinary. But the stews carried the seeds of their own bad reputation, and here is the gentle dark comedy of the word itself. Rather than cleanliness, the church frowned, the town councils fretted, and then, later, came the great fear that the warm shared water itself spread disease, that the open pores of a hot bath let pestilence in, and after the plague swept through, many a bath-house closed its doors for good, and a real and useful thing died of a bad idea about how sickness travels. So the later Middle Ages were, if anything, grubbier than the earlier ones, having talked themselves out of the bath. You may take from this whatever small lesson you like as you drift off. The medieval world certainly took the wrong one. Now to the bed and to the long night, which is our proper subject. Picture the chamber, or the single room that was chamber and kitchen and everything else. The bed, if you were comfortable enough to own a real one, was a wooden frame strung with ropes, and on the ropes a sack of straw, and the straw was the trouble. Straw is warm, and it is cheap, and it is also a city, a whole teeming country, for every small crawling thing that loves a human host. The straw was meant to be changed now and then, and the fleas to be driven out with herbs strewn underneath. Wormwood, fleabane, the very names tell you what people were fighting. But changing a whole bed's worth of straw was work, and the work got put off, as work does, and the small nation in. Fleas lived in it. Lice lived in the seams of your shirt and the warmth of your scalp and your beard. Bedbugs, where they had taken hold, lived in the frame itself, and came out in the dark with a patience that does not bear thinking about at this hour. The mattress flourished. You did not, as a rule, sleep alone, and not for romance. Beds were shared because beds were expensive, and the night was cold, and a body beside you was free heat. Children piled together. Servants shared. Travellers at an inn climbed in beside total strangers as a matter of course, and the only etiquette was to keep to your own side and not pull the whole blanket. So the close quarters were truly close. You slept in a tangle of other people's warmth and other people's breath, and, inevitably, other people's livestock of the smaller sort, for the fleas did not respect the boundary between one sleeper and the next. Linen sheets, where a household had them, were prized and laundered and were genuinely the cleanest thing you touched, which is why people who could afford nothing else still tried to afford linen against the skin. The good linen shirt, changed and washed, was the real workhorse of medieval. A single bed might be a modest commonwealth of the unwashed and the well-meaning, all of you doing your best, all of you slightly itchy. The bedding itself wore the year upon it. Hygiene, drawing the grease and sweat off the body so the body need not be scrubbed. But blankets of wool were seldom washed at all, and the straw beneath held the damp of the room and the smoke of the fire and the memory of every night before this one. A medieval bed smelled of wood smoke and tallow and bodies and herbs and, faintly, of the barn. To you it would be overwhelming. To the sleeper of that age it was simply the smell of night, the smell of being warm and safe and indoors with the door barred, and there is something almost tender in that the whole fragrant, crawling, smoky muddle was, to them, the very scent of comfort. And the air of the room would not help you. The window, if there was one, was a shutter, closed against the cold, so the night sealed itself in with the people and the fire's smoke and the chamber pot in the corner, that no one fancied carrying out into the freezing dark until morning. Damp clung to the walls. A dog might be in with you, a useful dog, a warm dog, a dog also entertaining a population of fleas it was generously willing to share. And over it all lay the ordinary grime of a life lived close to soil and animals and smoke and tallow light. A grime so universal that it was invisible, that no one remarked on, because to remark on the smell of the world is like remarking on the weight of the air. So this is the medieval night in its full unwashed truth, and I tell it to you not to trouble your sleep, but to soften it. Because for all the lice and the long unchanged straw and the shuttered smoky dark, those sleepers slept. They scratched and turned and pulled the rough wool up to the chin and drifted off in a warm crowded room that would horrify a modern nose and never gave it a thought. Your own bed is clean, your sheets washed, your air sweet and the night quiet, and you have only to lie here and let the centuries do the itching for you. Rest now. You are, by every standard those long-gone sleepers could imagine, gloriously, impossibly clean, and the only thing left in the dark with you is sleep. The night is dark, and you are warm, and somewhere beyond your window the cold is doing its slow, patient work, but it cannot reach you here. Tonight let us talk of the body and its quiet betrayals, in an age that knew far too well how easily flesh could turn against its owner. Do not be alarmed, we are only visiting. You may keep your good health folded under the blanket with you, where it belongs. To live in the medieval town was to live in close company with illness, the way one lives in company with weather. It came and it went, and sometimes it lingered, and you learned not to look at it too directly. The way you might not look at a bad-tempered dog, you must nonetheless pass each morning. There were no clear maps of the body's interior, no understanding of the tiny crawling things that did so much of the damage. Instead there was the old and tidy theory of the four humours, those four fluids that were thought to slosh about inside you in their proper proportions, and the idea that sickness came when one of them rose too high or sank too low. You were too hot or too cold, or too damp or too dry, and a physician with a learned frown and a urine flask would tell you which, and recommend that you be bled a little, or purged a little, or that you eat fewer onions. It was, when you think about it, a remarkably soothing way to be wrong about everything. And so when the body broke out in something visible, in heat and redness and sores, people reached for the words they had. They spoke of fevers and fluxes and agues, of the quotidian fever that came every day, and the tertian that came every third, ticking through the calendar like a grim and tireless clock. They spoke, especially, of burnings. The skin was where the inner trouble showed itself, and a great many conditions were lumped together under that frightened heading of a fire under the skin, a heat that would not cool. There were the rashes and the rots, the weeping and the scaling, the things that itched and the things that spread. Some of these were the small miseries of crowded living, of damp wool and unwashed bedding and water. You would not today so much as wash a turnip in. Others were graver, and the line between the two was never as clear as anyone wished, which is precisely what made the whole business so frightening. But of all the afflictions that walked those streets, one cast a longer shadow than the rest, and its name still carries a chill of fear out of all proportion to the reality. Leprosy. The very word arrives wearing a bell and a hood. The medieval mind held a special dread of it, this slow, disfiguring sickness that ate at the nerves and the skin, and seemed, to those watching, like a kind of living decay, a death that forgot to finish. And here is one of those gentle ironies of history, the kind that keeps us company through the long hours. The disease itself is, in truth, only mildly contagious and slow, and most of those who met it never caught it at all. Yet the response to it was vast, organized, and absolute. There may be no better example of a society fearing a thing far more than the thing deserved, and arranging all of its institutions around that fear with tremendous, anxious care. A person suspected of the affliction would be examined, sometimes by other sufferers who knew the signs, sometimes by a panel of the wary, and if judged to have it, would be separated from the living world by a ritual that was nothing less than a funeral for someone still breathing. In some places the unfortunate stood in a grave, or in a church draped in black, and heard the service for the dead spoken over them while they yet stood upright and warm, and then walked out of their old life entirely. They were given the bell or the clapper to carry, to warn the healthy of their approach, and a long list of forbiddings. You may not enter the mill. You may not drink from the common well. You may not touch goods in the market with your bare hand, but only with a stick. You may not walk the narrow lane where you cannot keep your distance from those you pass. And yet, and here the picture softens a little, as so many medieval pictures do when you lean in close, those houses were often founded in genuine charity, endowed by the guilty rich and the gentle pious, who saw in the suffering of the afflicted a holy thing, a soul, being purified by torment in. It was a whole second body of law written for the bodies cast out, and it followed them to the edge of town and beyond, to the leper houses that stood, by careful design, just outside the walls, near the road, but never on it. This life, so as to shine the brighter in the next. The leper was both outcast and, strangely, blessed, walking proof of mortality that the comfortable could pity and fund, and thereby ease their own way toward heaven. To be cast out was terrible. To be cast out and yet prayed for, housed and fed by the arms of strangers, was a fate stitched together out of cruelty and kindness in equal and bewildering measure. People are like that. They were then, and they are now, and there is something almost restful in how little that has changed. Then, as the medieval centuries wore toward their close and the great old leprosy began, mysteriously, to fade from the land, a new horror arrived to take its place, sweeping out of the wars and the ports and the crowded roads at the very end of the 15th century. They called it many things, and each nation blamed its neighbour, for it is an old human habit to give one's diseases a foreign passport. To one people it was the disease of the others across the border, and to those others it was the disease of the first, and so the blame bounced merrily back and forth across the map, while the affliction itself paid no attention to borders at all. The great pox, many came to call it, to set it apart from the smallpox that everyone already knew, and it announced itself with sores and aches and a slow ruin that could hide for years and then return. It moved with frightening speed through exactly the kind of close, crowded, transient world we have been wandering through tonight, the world of the inn and the camp and the busy quarter where strangers met and parted. The remedies offered for it were, if anything, worse than the silence of having none. The most famous was a treatment built on mercury, that bright and poisonous metal, rubbed into the skin or breathed in as fumes, until the sufferer drooled and shook and lost their teeth, on the cheerful old logic that a cure should be felt to be working. A night of mercury and a lifetime of pox, ran the rueful saying, and you can hear in it the dark, tired humour of people who had learned to laugh quietly at things that could not be helped, because the only other choice was to weep, and weeping kept no one warm. This was the body's lot, then. In those narrow streets we had been walking together, a fragile, precious, mostly mysterious vessel, sailed without a chart through waters full of rocks no one could see. They feared the burning under the skin. They rang the bell before the leper. They blamed the pox on the people over the hill. And through it all they went on living and loving and trading and brewing their thin ale and getting up the next cold morning to do it again, because the body, for all its risks, was the only one they had, and it carried them faithfully enough, most days, from one ordinary dawn to the next. So may yours carry you now, gently, down into sleep, untroubled by bells or saws or learned men with flasks, warm and whole, and entirely, blessedly well. Rest easy. The night will keep, and the morning, when it comes, will find you in much better shape than anyone in this chapter. There was once nothing in the world so reliably interesting as a stranger, and the house you are drifting toward tonight made its quiet living from strangers. By day the quarter was ordinary enough, a knot of leaning timber houses near the river or the town wall, but by night it filled with the sort of people a town both needed and pretended not to see. You would have learned, had you lived nearby, to read the evening by the sound of footsteps in the lane, and to guess from a man's boots and his accent roughly how far he had come and how much trouble he might be. First came the soldiers, because soldiers were always coming or going somewhere, and a town with a garrison or a castle nearby was never short of them. A man fresh from a campaign had pay in his purse for once, blisters healing, and a powerful wish to be somewhere warm where nobody shouted orders. He spent quickly and unwisely, which was precisely the point, and the women and the alewives and the dice-men of the quarter regarded him with the tender affection one feels for a sheep that has wandered in unshorn. When a whole company passed through, or worse, when an army wintered nearby, the quarter swelled like a sponge in a bucket. Prices rose, tempers shortened, and the town watch developed a sudden interest in early bedtimes that they enforced on everyone except the men with swords. After the soldiers, or alongside them, came the sailors and the boatmen, for any town on a navigable river or near the sea breathed in and out with the tides of trade. A sailor had been at sea or on the barges for weeks, with the same dozen faces and the same salt biscuit, and he stepped ashore with the wide, slightly stunned look of a man who cannot believe the ground has stopped moving. It knew which ships were in by the new songs in the lanes and the new bruises on the watchmen, and it knew that a sailor was generous on the first night, broke by the third and gone with the next favourable wind, which made him in many ways the ideal guest, since he never stayed long enough to. He too had wages, and a sailor's wages had a way of evaporating between the gangplank and the third tavern. The quarter knew him well. Become a problem you had to remember. Then there were the merchants, the travelling men of business who moved between fairs and markets with pack-horses and ledgers, and an air of respectability. They were keen to set down at the town gate like a heavy bag. A merchant on the road was a merchant a long way from his wife, his neighbours, his parish priest, and everyone who might tell tales, and human nature being what it eternally is, distance from home loosened a great many collars. These were the quarter's better-paying clientele, the ones who wanted a quiet upstairs room and discretion and a cup of decent wine, and who ticked well to be treated as gentlemen, rather than as the sweating, anxious wool-factors they actually were. The keepers of these houses understood the trade in dignity as well as anything else, and sold it at a fair mark-up. Market days drew the countryside in, and fair days drew the world. A great medieval fair was a tide that came once or twice a year and lifted every boat in the harbour, honest and otherwise. For a fortnight the town tripled in size. Merchants from Flanders and Lombardy and the Rhineland filled the inns, jugglers and tooth-pullers and relic sellers worked the crowds, and the quarter did the brisk, exhausted, slightly hysterical business of a seaside town in high season. Apprentices, bound for 7 years to a master and forbidden marriage until their indentures were done, formed a vast, restless population of healthy youths with no licensed outlet and a great deal of pent-up energy, which is why apprentices feature in nearly every town, riot, brawl, and moral panic. The authorities, who at other times of year might fret about morals, looked at the customs revenue pouring in and discovered a sudden capacity for tolerance. A fair was money, and money has always been a wonderful solvent of principle. And the young men, of course, the young men were everywhere. In the records. Students were worse or better, depending on your trade. A university town was a particular gift to the quarter, since it supplied a steady annual crop of young men away from home for the first time, theoretically studying logic and theology, practically discovering that their allowance did not stretch nearly as far as their ambitions. The medieval moralists wrote sermon after sermon about students and what they got up to, which tells you both that it happened constantly and that nobody ever managed to stop it. Which brings us, with a discreet cough, to the clergy, and here the medieval record is gloriously, scandalously honest. Bishops thundered, councils legislated, visitations were conducted with much tutting and many fines, and yet the lower clergy and the friars turn up in the court rolls and the satires and the bawdy tales with a frequency that suggests the gap between the rule and the practice was, let us say, the Church owned a third of everything, employed a sizable fraction of every town, and was staffed by men who had taken vows of celibacy at an age when most of them had no idea what they were giving up. Considerable. The quarter knew them by their tonsures hidden under borrowed hoods, and their hurried sideways manner, and the quarter, being a place of business rather than judgment, took their coin like anyone else's, and kept its mouth shut, which was after all the only professional courtesy that mattered. A Genoese merchant brushing shoulders with a Welsh archer, an apprentice who should be home, a student who should be studying, a friar who should be praying, a boatman who should be sleeping off the river, a watchman taking a quiet bribe to look the other way, an alewife topping up the thin ale, A. So picture the crowd on a busy night, all of it pressed into a few crooked lanes lit by the orange smear of a tallow lamp in a window. Fiddler scraping out a tune for pennies, a thief drifting through the press with light fingers and lighter conscience. It was loud and close and ripe and rough, and it mixed together men who would never have shared a bench anywhere else in the whole rigid, ranked, sumptuary-lord world of the Middle Ages. Out in the daylight you were your station, your guild, your acre, your birth. The town disapproved in the morning and depended on it by night, taxed it with one hand and blessed itself with the other, and the quarter endured all of it with the weary good humour of a place that has seen every kind of human being walk through its door and found them, on the whole, much more. In here, after dark, you were mostly just your purse and your manners, and the quarter judged you by neither very harshly. There was a kind of dreadful democracy to it all, the great leveller of appetite and loneliness, flattening Duke's son and ditcher's son into the same patient queue. Alike than they would ever have admitted in the cold light of day. The lamps burned low, the river slid past in the dark, and the long, mixed, murmuring night closed gently over them all, the soldier and the scholar and the sinful friar alike, every one of them at last too tired to be anything but asleep. The night does not announce itself with trumpets. It simply arrives, the way water arrives in a leaking boat, and one moment you are watching a baker shut his window against the cold, and the next you realise that the streets you walked so cheerfully by day have changed their character entirely. Doors are barred, shutters are pulled too. The honest folk, who are mostly the poor folk, have gone to bed because candles cost money and sleep costs nothing. And what remains abroad in the quarter is a thinner, sharper population that does its business in the dark, precisely because the dark is where such business thrives. You, standing in the lane with your modern softness and your unbroken teeth, are now in a place that would happily relieve you of both. Consider first the simplest danger, which is also the most common, and that is drink. The medieval town ran on ale the way a mill runs on water, ceaselessly and without much thought, because the water itself was suspect, and the ale at least had been boiled in its making, and so was safer than the river. People drank in the morning, and they drank at noon, and by the time the tavern candles were lit, they had been drinking for a good long while, and a man who has been drinking weak ale all day is a tired man. But a man who has found his way to the strong stuff is a different animal. The tavern is warm. It is one of the few warm places. And so it fills, and tempers loosen, and old grievances about a debt or a boundary stone or a slighted sister come bubbling up through the ale like marsh gas, and a knife is drawn. Nearly every man carried a knife, you understand, not as a weapon, but as a tool, for cutting his bread and his meat, and a tool is only a tool until the moment it is buried in someone's ribs over a spilled cup. The court rolls of these towns are thick with such killings, and the saddest thing about them is how small the cause always was. A man dead in a gutter over a wager of 2 pennies. A skull caved with a stool because someone laughed at the wrong moment. You would not have started the fight, perhaps, but you need not start a fire to burn in it, and if the brawl spares you, the robbery may not. The lanes were narrow and crooked and entirely unlit, save where some pious soul had left a lamp burning before a wayside shrine, and a stranger walking those lanes at night carried his purse at his belt for all the world to feel for in the blackness. There were stretches of every town that even the locals avoided after dark, by the tanneries or down toward the river stairs, places with names that everybody understood, and into these you might wander cheerfully, map in hand, wondering at the quaint old architecture, right up until the moment A. The cut-purse was an artist of his kind, and the footpad less subtle, a fellow who simply stepped from a doorway with a cudgel and let gravity and surprise do the rest. hand closed over your mouth. The thieves were not always desperate men, though many were. Some were organised with receivers who would take your cloak and your buckles and your good boots and have them sold in another town by the week's end, so that even if you complained there was nothing left to find. Against all this stood the watch, and you must not imagine anything like a police force, with its training and its discipline and its salary. The curfew bell rang, the literal couvre-feu, the covering of the fire, and after it sounded you were meant to be indoors, and an honest man caught wandering had best have a good reason and a lantern of his own, because a man abroad in the dark without light was assumed to be up to no good, and the watch was your neighbours, ordinary householders, compelled by custom and law to take their turn walking the streets after curfew with a lantern and a staff, and a strong wish to be in bed, could be seized on that suspicion alone. The watch would challenge you, and if your answers were slurred or your story thin or your accent strange, they would lay hands on you and march you off, and here the great helplessness of your situation becomes clear. You have no papers they would recognise. You know no one who would vouch for you. You cannot name your master, or your guild, or your parish. In a world where every soul belongs somewhere and to someone, you belong nowhere and to no one. And that is not freedom, it is danger. Because the masterless man, the vagrant, the stranger without surety, was exactly the figure the whole apparatus of the night was built to catch. So they would put you in the stocks, very likely, or the pillory, which was the same indignity raised to standing height. You would sit with your ankles clamped through a wooden frame in the open marketplace, and the genius of the punishment, if you can call it genius, was that it cost the town nothing and entertained the whole town besides. Your fellow citizens, the very ones who had ignored you the day before, would now gather to look at you, and the kinder ones might merely jeer, and the less kind would throw things, and what they threw depended on the season and on how much they disliked the look of you. Mud, certainly. Rotten vegetables, dung, the contents of a chamber pot, the occasional stone thrown by someone who had perhaps had too much of that strong ale. You could not protect your face. You could not move. You simply had to endure it for as many hours as the bailiff decreed, a lesson in the absolute power of a community over the one who stands outside it, and you, my friend, stand entirely outside it. This is the truth the soft modern traveller must absorb before sleep takes them. The danger of this world was not the occasional dramatic outrage, but the everyday absence of any cushion between you and disaster. There was no ambulance. A wound that we would clean and stitch in 20 minutes might, in that lane, fester quietly over a week until the fever took you, and the surgeon, if you could afford one, might do more harm than the wound. There was no recourse against the powerful. If a great man's servants beat you, you swallowed it, because the law bent visibly toward those who owned the land, and the mill, and the ear of the sheriff, and a poor man's word weighed nothing against a rich man's. The whole arrangement of society rested on knowing your place and staying in it, and the violence of the night was simply the place's edges made sharp, a reminder of what waited for anyone who slipped through. And the exploitation was quieter than the violence, but no less complete. The man who hired you for a day's labour could pay you in clipped coin, or in spoiled bread, or in nothing at all, and where would you go to complain? The lender charged what the desperate would bear. The miller took his measure of your flour, and a little extra besides, because the Lord's mill was the only mill, and you were forbidden to grind your own grain at home, a small daily robbery sanctified by custom and enforced by fines. You were powerless in 100 small ways that wore at a life like water wearing at stone, and the genuinely poor, The widow and the orphan and the broken old soldier lived perpetually one bad week from the ditch. You see, then, why you would not last. It is not that you are weak, exactly, though you are. It is that you lack the one thing this world ran on, which is belonging, the dense web of kin and neighbour and master and parish that told everyone who you were and held you, however roughly, in a place. Strip that away, and the night closes in. The brawl, the footpad, the suspicious watch, the stocks, the cheating master, the festering wound, the long indifference of the powerful to the small. Lie back now, warm and safe and improbably long-lived, behind a door that locks and beneath a roof that does not leak, and let the gentle horror of it all settle over you like a blanket. You have survived a day in this world only because you are not truly in it. And tomorrow, in the last of these tales, you may at last be allowed to leave. For now, simply sleep, and be glad the curfew bell was rung for someone else. The night is nearly over, and you have very nearly survived it, which is more than most could say of an actual medieval night, where survival was a daily lottery you did not remember entering. Listen now, in these last drowsy minutes, as the dark thins at the edges of the shutters and turns the colour of weak ale. Somewhere a cock is clearing its throat for the great performance it has rehearsed every dawn of its short, indignant life. The town is exhaling. And you, warm and dry and unbitten, are allowed at last to be sleepy, properly sleepy, the kind of sleepy that the people in our story almost never were. Let the dawn come up slowly over the rooftops, the way it actually did, with no hurry at all. The thatch is silvered with dew, and the smoke that never quite leaves the air begins to glow rather than loom. Down in the lanes, the night soil is still where the night soil was left, but the light is kind to it, the way light is kind to everything for a few forgiving minutes before the world wakes up enough to notice the smell again. A dog stretches. A cat that has been murdering things in the granary all night settles down at last to look respectable. And from 100 small houses come the small sounds of people who have nowhere to be but who must be there early, anyway. A cough, a pot scraped, a child told to hush. Think, before you drift, of everything you have wandered through these long quiet hours. The mud and the law and the money that was always short. The barber who would bleed you for a fee and shave you for slightly less. The miller everyone owed and nobody trusted. The wise woman with her herbs that sometimes worked. The lord up in his cold stone hall, no warmer in his soul than you, just better insulated by other people's labour. The plague that came and went like a tide that occasionally forgot to go back out. The teeth, the fleas, the smoke, the saints, the endless, patient, back-breaking, sky-watching work of simply staying alive until tomorrow and then doing it again. It was, by any honest reckoning, brutal. Children were buried with a regularity that would break a modern heart, and broke plenty of those hearts too, whatever the gentle myth that people loved less because they lost more. They did not love less. They simply lived inside a grief that never fully left the house, the way damp never fully leaves a wall, and they carried it and got on, because getting on was the only medicine anyone could afford. A bad harvest could empty a village. A fever could empty a family. A war you had no part in could trample your one field flat in an afternoon, and then the men who trampled it would ask, with genuine surprise, why you had nothing to feed them. And yet it was so deeply, stubbornly human that you would recognize nearly all of it, the gossip over the wash, the grumbling about taxes and weather, and the young, those 3 eternal subjects. The festival when the work was done, the ale that was watery but warm in the chest, the songs that everyone knew and no one had written down. The small kindnesses, a neighbour's loaf, a midwife's steady hands at 2 a.m, a stranger given a place by the fire because turning him out into that dark would have been a sin, and also, more practically, bad luck. People fell in love and were married badly and married well and loved their children fiercely and lied to the tax collector and laughed at the priest behind his back and prayed to him to their faces. They were exactly as foolish and as decent and as tired as we are, only colder and damper and a great deal closer to death. So let us be honest with each other now, in the soft grey light, as honest as friends who are both half asleep. You would not have lasted a night. I say it with the greatest possible affection. The water alone would have undone you, the water that everyone drank and that quietly carried away so many, the water you would have sipped without a second thought, because the second thought had not been invented yet. The cold would have got into your unaccustomed bones. The food would have offended a stomach raised on things that come sealed and labelled. And the first small cut, the first splinter from an honest piece of wood, would have begun its slow private campaign against you while you slept, with no one in the parish able to do a single useful thing about it except pray and bleed you and pray again. You would have lasted, I think, until about the second meal, and then politely excused yourself and gone looking for a doctor. And that, ironically, is what would have finished you off. There is no shame in it. Almost no one reading the comfortable present back into that hard past would have lasted either. In a moment the first church bell will ring for the first prayer of the day, and the town that survived another night will halse itself upright and reach for its tools, and the great slow wheel of medieval life will turn over once more, the same today as yesterday, the same tomorrow as today, world. That is rather the point of these long nights of ours, not to feel superior to them, the poor brave damp-footed dead, but to feel quietly, enormously grateful for the soft ridiculous miracle of a warm room and clean water, and a tomorrow you can reasonably expect to see. The bells are about to start, without end, or so they devoutly hoped. But you do not have to get up. That is the marvellous, undeserved luxury of where and when you are. You may let the bell ring for them and not for you. You may stay exactly where you are, warm under the covers, on the right side of 700 years. So close your eyes the rest of the way, and let the medieval dawn fade out gently behind them. Let the cock crow somewhere far off and harmless. Let the mud and the smoke and the kind, tired faces sink down into the soft dark where good sleep lives. You have done the only thing required of you tonight, which was to rest, and you have done it admirably, far better than you would have done the milking. Thank you for spending these slow hours with me here at night, Stories, where history is long and the night is longer, and nothing, mercifully, is required of you at all. Sleep well, you marvellous survivor of a softer age. The town will keep without you. The dead will keep their stories, and there are so many more of them, waiting in the warm dark for the next time you cannot sleep. Until then, breathe slow, sink down, and drift off gently. Good night, sleep deep, and come back soon. We will leave a candle in the window and a story by the fire, for whenever you wander back.